Welcome to Mandarin Blueprint's series on Chinese word structure. So, why is it important to learn how Chinese words are structured? Well, it's because the vocabulary layer of Chinese is actually one of the simplest and most logical layers. And if you can understand the basic rules of how characters relate to each other to create words, you're going to give yourself a leg up in understanding new words. Many times you can get a basic rule, a basic pattern that you can generalize across the language. It's quite useful to learn. We're big on not focusing too much on theory and making sure you get as much input as possible. But when I was at Sichuan University, this was one of the only classes that I found to be incredibly useful and was constantly reinforcing as I continued to learn Chinese. So we think it's well worth focusing on the different word structures in the language. But before we get too far into this, we need to discuss what a word is in Chinese. And the way to do that is by focusing on morphemes. Now, we talked in phase 1 of the course about how Chinese characters are morphemes. And the best way to think of a morpheme is just that it's a mini meaning. It's the smallest part of a language with meaning. And so you could think of this like the word unexpected. This word has 3 morphemes. And so this illustrates the point that some morphemes are words like expect, and some morphemes are not words like un or ed. And so let's talk about how that might work in Chinese by first starting with single character morphemes. So that's to say one character, one morpheme. It's by far the most common. This is the type of thing that you'll see with a character like shan. You don't need to add anything to shan to successfully say a word. However, there are some characters in Chinese where you couldn't just say it by itself, but shan you can. And that's not to say that you can't combine shan with other characters to create more complicated words like shanlu, which means mountain road, or shanpo, which means mountain slope. But you can still just point over there and say, hey, look at that shan, that's fine. And so that's an example where you'll see one character, one morpheme, and it's also a word. Now let's look at a couple of other examples. Ren for person. Not surprising that such simple, basic ideas like mountain and person would have maintained their one character, one word rule. Now, it can also apply to verbs. For example, 走. This can mean walk or to leave. And once again, you can use it by itself. So what about the types of single character morphemes that are not words? Well, these are like un or ed in unexpected. There's clearly meaning there, but you can't just say un by itself. So how about this one? Jian. This means tip, as in the tip of something. So it's probably pretty obvious right off the bat why you can't say this by itself, because if you just say tip without any extra context, the natural question is tip of what, right? So this character is actually quite interesting too, because the top part of the character is the character for xiao, and the bottom component of this character is the character for big. So that's exactly what like an arrow does, the tip of an arrow. It's big at the bottom and it gets small at the top. So with jian, you're going to have to combine it with something else. For example, 舌尖, 舌尖, which means tip of your tongue. So 舌, tongue, 舌尖, tip of your tongue. How about this one, ming? This is a common one that many beginners will make a mistake with because they'll think you can just say ming by itself. And it's not obvious that you couldn't, but in this case, you can't. You say 名字 to indicate my name, for example. 我的名字是 Phil. My name is Phil. But you can't just say 我的名 without anything else. The feeling like name of what? Oh, it's the name letter. Okay, got it. You could also say 出名, 出名, which means that you became famous. So 出 means to go out or come out, and so your name has come out to the public, so you're now famous. So that's a pretty cool conceptualization. And then 昨, this is a good example. It's better to say actually that it means yester. It's like the yester in yesterday. So you can't just say yester by itself, but you can say 昨天 as in yesterday, 天. So these are examples where you have one character, one morpheme, and some of them are words and some of them are not. This is by far the most common situation where there's one character, one morpheme. But there are other possibilities. For example, you could have a double character morpheme, which means that you need both characters to create one meaning. Let's take a look. There's usually two sources for these. You can have borrowed foreign words is the first one. And so take something like shafa, shafa. So if you were to think, what might this be? Now, before I reveal what this is, and you can think about it, it's pretty obvious, it does not mean sand, send out, because that's what the first character, sha, it means sand, or like, gritty material. And then fa means to send out. Well, that has nothing to do with the meaning of sofa. It's just mimicking the foreign word, shafa. And so you need both of these characters together to create the meaning of sofa, and their original meanings aren't there anymore. So it's not two meanings combining together to create a third meaning. That's called a compound word, and that's the majority of words in Chinese. This is not that. It's just two characters with one morpheme. Let's look at this one, 可乐. We covered this in the pronunciation mastery course, so many of you will already know this means cola. And again, 可 by itself means can, as in not like a can of Coke. That would be good, but no, like a can like can do, right? And then le means happiness. And so in a way, you could say that it's kind of cool because you're saying can have happiness with cola, but still, that's really just made up. At the end of the day, it just sounds like cola, 可乐. Now, this is a good one. 黑客, 黑客. So if you listen to this, you can understand why it might mean hacker. But this is actually both, because usually I would say, okay, you need the two characters, they lost their original meaning. But in this case, they actually kind of kept their original meaning, because 黑 in this context means black or dark, and then 客 means it means guest. But guest can also have this connotation with software. So like there's the 客户端 is the client or the software that you use. For example, WeChat has a desktop 客户端. And so what that is referring to is that you can be the dark guest on someone else's computer, the person who's not meant to be there. And so interestingly enough, with 黑客, they combined both the sound and the meanings of the characters, which is pretty neat. But that's not the only source of the two character morphemes. The other is ancient Chinese. So, for example, the word 徘徊, these two characters cannot exist without each other. And while I can't confirm this, I suspect that the reason this started to happen is because ancient Chinese mostly had one character words. There was a long history of Chinese primarily having one character words as the only thing. And then you can imagine that eventually that would start to get a little bit confusing. And so they would start to add in two character words like 仿佛, or 蝴蝶, especially with something like an insect. Insects, you discover more and more and more of them. Eventually, you run out of characters. You're like, there's not enough characters to continue to keep having this one character per word system. So slowly, two character words prop up, and some of them survive to modern Chinese. So there's no real way to notice this ahead of time, but you will get a chance to learn them as you go. And there's not that many of them. They don't take up a huge proportion of modern Chinese. And finally, there are multiple character morphemes. So these are 3 or 4 characters that all only have one meaning. And these are pretty much exclusively coming from borrowed words. So take a look at these 3 words and take a minute, see if you can figure out what they might mean. 巧克力, 蒂斯尼, 奥林匹克. Well, 巧克力, chocolate, right? So you can imagine how they might have come up with that. And again, all 3 characters are required in order for this to make sense as one meaning. And again, these characters do have meanings by themselves. 巧 can mean it can mean coincidental, and then ke can mean gram, as in a gram and a kilogram, and li means power, but they don't mean that in the context of the word 巧克力. They're just mimicking the English sound. Disney, Disney. All three of these characters are very common in English transliterations, and you get used to that as you keep learning Chinese. You see characters like this, and you go, "Oh, this must be somebody's name, or this must be the name of a company or something." 奥林匹克, the Olympics, right? So you can see these are just borrowed foreign words, and that's why you can have multiple characters, but only one meaning. Now, we've been talking about morphemes, which are meanings, and some of them are words, some of them are not. So let's talk now about the difference between compound words and pure words. So we're switching from talking about morphemes now to talking about words in and of themselves. So let's first talk about these pure words. So single character words, we've kind of already touched on this. These are things like shui or zhou or chi or sha. They're very ancient usually. They don't tend to have too much extra that you need to know about them, and they tend to cover things that are very basic about the human experience. We all have to deal with water. We're all afraid of getting killed. We all need to eat, and we all walk, right? These are more ancient things. But you'll see later that when you get to the compound words, that's when you can take these same characters, these same words, and expand upon them. And then, of course, there's multi-character words that, again, they're many characters, but they're only one morpheme usually. Like bikini is a bikini, or 蝴蝶, which came from the ancient Chinese, meaning butterfly, or cafe, meaning coffee. So again, these are not combining the different meanings of the characters to create a new meaning. They're just mimicking the English sound. So these are the more pure words. So that is what we cover in the basics of just one character words, one character morphemes, double character morphemes, multiple character morphemes. All of those pale in comparison to the compound words. But let's think about why this happened, though. Why did Chinese end up having so many two-character words when it originally was monosyllabic in ancient Chinese? And for those of you, there's a few nitpickers out there over the years who've said, like, hey, ancient Chinese wasn't always monosyllabic. And yes, ancient Chinese covers a very long period of time. So it evolved, and you could get into any, 100-year period of ancient Chinese and get into lots of detail. But it certainly moved in a general direction from being monosyllabic to two-character and three- and four-character. So during this time of ancient Chinese, and there were so many homophones that would happen. And here's an example. This is an example that comes out a lot. But if I were to start reading this poem here, you'll get what the problem might be. So starting from the beginning, 是是诗是诗是是诗是时时诗诗是时时是是是诗时时是时诗是. And I'm not going to keep going. It's all 是 in one tone or another. And so this is an example of why it started to get a little bit untenable to continue with this monosyllabic way of going about things. And actually, the guy who wrote this poem was kind of making fun of Chinese for the fact that there were so many homophones. He wasn't trying to, it wasn't a coincidence that he wrote it this way. But just the fact that it was possible made it very interesting, and you could see how the more complex language became and the more things there were to name, the more actions there were, the more insects that were discovered, the more philosophical concepts that came about, it became untenable to continue with this monosyllabic way of going about things. And so it became polysyllabic as it developed, making most of the words two syllables, and these are compound words. So a compound word is when you have two separate morphemes combining together and creating a new meaning. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next video, or really the next 7 videos. So look out for that, the 7 types of compound words. We'll see you there.